So welcome everyone to the fourth seminar in our new online lecture series on resource struggles and international law under occupation, convened by myself, Julia Dehm, and my colleagues Sahiba Maqbool and Caitlin Murphy. Before introducing our speaker, we want to acknowledge that we're joining the seminar from occupied lands and that struggles for land justice, for water justice and resource justice continue across this continent. We want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the rightful owners of this land, on which we're joining the call that their land was stolen and their sovereignty was never ceded. We pay our respects to their elders past and present.
So this online lecture series seeks to foster interdisciplinary and historically inflected discussions about how international law both shapes and is shaped by struggles over natural resources. This semester, the series is focusing on resource struggles in the context of occupation around the world. We're collectively exploring how struggles over resource plunder and exploitation shape the dynamics of occupation, and how peoples under occupation are contesting extraction and asserting ownership and sovereignty over resources as part of broader resistance movements. So speakers are examining resource struggles under occupation in Greenland, West Papua, Palestine, Kashmir, Bougainville, and Western Sahara. We're going to consider the different forms of political contestation that they produce and how resource struggles might be mobilised to enliven political possibilities for self-determination and decolonisation.
We are delighted to have a wonderful line of speakers for our second semester, as well as Dr. Omer Aijazi, who we will hear from today. We will have lectures from Professor Kristin Leslett on Bougainville, Dr. Randy Irwin on Western Sahara, and Dr. Adil Abu Hussain on Palestine. Details of these other lectures are in the chat. Additionally, Dr. Anna Saunders and Julia are convening a reading group on the theme of making and unmaking natural resources. If you are interested, more details are also in the chat. So as our subject of the lecture today is Kashmir, we would like to express our solidarity with the peoples of Jammu and Kashmir across all regions, including Gilgit, occupied Kashmir, Azad Kashmir, Ladakh, and Jammu, in their ongoing struggles for permanent sovereignty over natural resources. Confronted with the sustained repression and structural violence from both India and Pakistan, their struggles embody an urgent assertion of having their political and economic subjectivity recognized. While the aspirations of the diverse communities within Jammu and Kashmir may vary, their shared struggles of justice centers on reclaiming autonomy over their resources, safeguarding their indigenous ways of being, and resisting the intersecting forces of occupation, environmental harm, and economic exploitation.
I'm now really delighted to introduce our speaker today. Omer Aijazi is a critical disaster studies scholar and decolonial ethnographer of borderland South Asia, with long-standing commitments in the disputed territory of Kashmir and its continuity with northern Pakistan. Questioning disciplinary norms within disaster studies and the carceral logics of South Asia, his work explores how people imagine and claim their worlds in the wake of colonial ruin and environmental ruin while in the shadow of empire. Omer is a lecturer in disaster and climate crisis at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester. He'll speak for about 40 minutes, drawing on his fantastic recent book, Atmospheric Violence, Disaster and Repair in Kashmir, and then we'll have some time for questions. Thanks again so much for speaking to us, and the floor is now yours.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just going to pull up my slides. Are you able to see the slides? Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Sahiba, Caitlin, and Julia for this invitation. And it's great to be here in the company of new friends, fellow racialized scholars, and other mission-driven researchers, students, and activists. And before I start, I do want to remind everyone that we are in the belly of the beast, in the imperial core, and at the heart of the military-industrial academic complex. And in this current political moment, students across universities in many parts of the world, including where I'm based, are taking on extraordinary risk in lobbying our institutions to cut ties with corporations and entities that profit from war, military occupation, and genocide in Palestine and beyond. And our students are, holding us accountable, and it's the same sense of accountability that compelled me to write this book. So I wrote this book to consider knowledge as emancipation, to consider academic practice as a way to open up the world, not contain it, and to welcome back life's excessiveness, brilliance, and exuberance, and back into our writing, thinking, and theorizing. So how do we work with stories that don't fit, or stories that don't correspond to the way we imagine and organize the world? And what if non-normativity is taken as the only stable sensibility and knowledge becomes a project of seeing and feeling from such a location? And for me, writing this book and doing the work that I do has meant intentionally refusing academic and disciplinary conventions that we feel so pressure to uphold and that have become so ingratiated in our scholarly identities and the professionalization of knowledge. And to recognize that, the ethical and political stakes often lie in the stories and not necessarily always in their analysis. So that our writing is not reduced to instrumentality and concepts are imagined more so as forms of care, repair, and kinship. And I like to think of myself, as a transdisciplinary decolonial scholars of sorts, at least I hope so, trained in both the social sciences and humanities. And the discipline where I become usually the most legible is anthropology. And that's also how I've sought citizenship in the university. So, in some days, like today, I'm an anthropologist, but hopefully not a capital A anthropologist. And by capital A anthropology, I mean an anthropology which doesn't get in the way of imperial knowledge production and doesn't interrupt colonial violence. And I think if not careful, every anthropologist or every, faces the danger of becoming a capital A anthropologist. And one can say the same for any disciplinary orientation one may be attached to. Métis scholar Zoe Todd wonders, when your body exceeds the limits of the body of the work you contribute to, what do you become? Waste, collateral damage? After all, disciplines and institutions don't like unruly bodies or bodies that permeate and puncture the walls of their cells. So my work takes ambition from anthropologists Deborah Thomas and Kamari Clark, who call for a radical humanism, which is an invitation to move beyond anthropology's positivist past and present, which in its quest for meaning and imposing legibility often reduces people to knowable subjects or data points and objects of analysis. So in many ways, this book and my broader work is also about keeping the anthropologist's power in check, or the expert academic's power in check, who I think for far too long has decided who is human or who is worthy of being human. And maybe it's not sufficient to simply, keep that power in check, but perhaps it's time to take it entirely away. And a little about myself, and I think this transparency is important given the context of the work that I do and also the stakes of ethnography, which is, a highly invasive practice, and essentially a form of trespass. So I was born and raised in Pakistan in the capital city. My grandparents from both sides left India during partition, and the struggles of, beginning anew in a context of lost nostalgia and emerging national pride from the background of my upbringing in a middle-class Muslim household. So growing up, my parents, pictured here, presented to me radically opposing modes of being in the world. My dad rose ranks as a technocrat and he retired as a devotee to the Pakistani state. He worked as a physicist and worked in the manufacturing of weapons of war. My mom is a community worker who relies on gut, grit, and intuition, and she runs a very modest women's support network in the city's so-called informal settlements. And my parents, embodied very different notions of what it means to devote yourself to people and place. My dad is regarded nationally as an expert, scientist, true Pakistani patriot, and he has a list of awards and medals to prove it. And my mom is simply known as Baji, which in Urdu means elder sister, on account of her close friendships with the women she works with. So I have to, constantly ask myself, how do I best devote myself to the communities whom I work with and the places that they live? From my location in the military industrial academic complex. And I think this question is important because it holds me in a state of productive tension and forces me to think more carefully about both the content and form of my scholarship. And to be honest, I don't want to necessarily hide behind the certitude and confidence of academic expertise. I'm also drawn to other kinds of investments and energies one can also bring to their praxis. And if you think about expertise, it's such a strange word. How can one even claim expertise in the lives of others? So, while I was trying to publish this book and, dealing with university presses, with peer review reports and the many times I've presented chapters at various conferences, I've realized that perhaps this book is not for everyone, which, is not what I should be saying. I should be saying, this book is universal, read it, but maybe it's not. I think the book demands a certain kind of reader, a very capacious reader. And that's because I do demand a lot from the reader, and I don't seek to sustain a singular narrative. My arguments are kaleidoscopic and elliptical. I try to weave texture, color, pattern, and my offerings are burdensome, for I don't provide instructions for landing or guidance on how the book should be read. And I think those who seek comfort in inherited knowledge or in tradition will find the text frustrating. And that's intentional because the lives of others should not be so easily consumable. Otherwise, reading risks becoming, just another rote and automatic and colonial mode of conquest. So I wrote this book with the explicit intention of favoring ethical relation over disciplinary certitude, to very purposefully reject canonical knowledge and to choose and prioritize world building over discipline building, to kind of reset the labels of creative, decolonial, experimental as default burn marks, not just as atypical approaches, and to consider knowledge production as a form of attunement rather than capture. So, if you're going to ask me, how does this work contribute to the literature? What kind of knowledge gaps does this fill? That's not the kind of questions the book will naturally lead you to, because I feel there's so much more at stake in these conversations. But since we're trained to think in those terms, I'll, get that question out of the way. So the work, tries to bring anthropology of violence and disaster literature in conversation with the capaciousness of affect theory, but held accountable to the ethical demands of Black studies and Indigenous studies, with the hopes of creating, further openings in how we understand life and disaster in Kashmir. And I'm aware that if one is not cautious and careful, Black and Indigenous studies can also become another hegemonic frame of reference, like another external imposition. But I take those risks anyway, and I invite the reader to take those risks with me. So, what might be enabled if you imagine Kashmir from elsewhere? And I do think, we need a far better reason for doing your work than just some, over-determined vision of incremental knowledge production, particularly if it's going to be something as invasive as ethnography, and that too of colonized peoples and colonized places, because the stakes are, much higher. So the book, or at least I hope so, also gives us an opportunity to renegotiate our expectations from scholarly text. And I think it's entirely possible to create our own ethos of adjudication. So what are the standards we want to be held against, which I think can be different from the standards set in our fields or disciplines. And when I say we, I'm not referring to the liberal we, there's likely no universal consensus amongst us, but rather my invocation of we is a call for community. It's an invitation to hold anthropology and academia accountable for its legacies of harm towards Black, Brown, queer, and Indigenous bodies. So in that spirit, and with these aspirations in mind, let's get more into the book. So the book is set in the disputed territory of Kashmir, and I imagine most of you know Kashmir is a former princely state, presently caught between the state-seeking nationalisms of Pakistan and India. Some part of it also lie within China. And I, in particular, work near the line of control. That is the de facto border that splinters the region of Kashmir into Pakistan and Indian-held areas. And my work takes place in the portion of Kashmir that is under Pakistan's jurisdiction and its extension outwards into northern and northwestern Pakistan. The line of control is heavily militarized, so much so that it is said to be visible from outer space. And the region I work in is home to the Pahari people, roughly people of the mountains, who speak the Pahari language and its many cognate forms. They're semi-nomadic pastoral communities. And regardless of how they're separated by Pakistan's internal borders, the Pahari people are connected via shared language, shared land-based lifestyles, migratory practices, and other forms of ecological knowledges and consciousness that stems from making life hospitable in the mountains, as opposed to merely being Pakistani or Kashmiri. So put differently, being Bahari exceeds these containments of the nation state. So, this is the kind of map of Kashmir we often expect to see, which, with Kashmir as a fixed geolocation. And that's because, for the most part, Kashmir is imagined as a fragment of South Asia, needing to be tamed, disciplined, and domesticated in line with visions of post-colonial state formation. And I think for those of you who work in South Asia will know that South Asia, and by extension, South Asian studies, is primarily viewed through the lens of India, which is considered to be the intellectual, political, and cultural heartbeat of the region, and constitutes a hegemonic frame of reference of sorts. And this means that the nation state, takes the front stage in most contemporary conversations on Kashmir, rendering Kashmiri life subservient to a rather Indian-centric history, denying the Kashmiri people the multiple political, ethical, and historical imaginations that situate them outside a framework of containment. There are other kinds of maps that are also possible. This is a sculpture from an Indian artist, Sadop Gupta. It's titled The Line of Control. It mimics a mushroom cloud resembling a nuclear explosion. And this refers to the fact that both India and Pakistan are nuclear armed states. This is yet another piece. It's also called The Line of Control. And this is by a Pakistani visual artist, Farida Batul. And she suggests, far more sensuous embrace of borders. Sarah Green notes that borders, much like sex and gender, are historically and socially constructed and performed, but are nonetheless real, having devastating implications for people. So the video playing in the background, shows Kashmiris on both sides of the line of control. It is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to cross the line of control to embrace relatives, friends, loved ones, other Kashmiri kin. And you can see people, waving at each other, gesturing, acknowledging each other, just reaffirming each other's moral presence. Catherine McKettrick describes the earth as skin, and she believes that philosophical attention is not only needed on present cartographic rules because they unjustly reify human hierarchies in place, but because these rules are alterable and there exists a terrain through which different stories can be told. And arguably, Kashmir's colonial present is as much the result of a historical process as it is of a permanent denial for it to become a different kind of political space. But as McKettrick reminds us, cartographic rules are indeed contestable, and different seizures of geography are possible. Where, for example, Kashmiris move freely, unencumbered by military checkposts, barbed wire, and border lines. Once while attending a debating competition in a school in Kashmir, Javed, a Kashmiri school teacher, stated that he wants his students to come together on Kashmir outside of India's imperial claws, Pakistan's overbearing bureaucracy, and China's giant stature. So what different stories can be told about Kashmir and the people who live there? And how can we think of Kashmir as a political and philosophical project and as an element of South Asia outside the framework of containment? And I think this is a serious challenge to an area studies model that draws on fixed and territorial notions of the nation state. But there are other forms of distributed and fractured sovereignties, which I think also need centering. So in this book, I try to locate Kashmir outside of its contemporary placement, both geographically and epistemologically. And I do this in two different ways. One, by investing in Kashmir of the Pahars, that is Kashmir of the mountains, and thinking about Kashmir through the Pahari people by establishing, the mountains as the center and not the periphery. Most writings on Kashmir and Kashmiri people focus on the Kashmir Valley and not the surrounding mountains, which are seen as empty, desolate, kind of cut off from Kashmir's intellectual and social pulse. And second, by refusing Kashmir's placement within the very carceral imaginations of South Asia. A reviewer of this book, when it was under consideration at a much different press, had a very strong reaction to the writing, demanding that the manuscript should be brought closer to home, in systematic relation to South Asian intellectual traditions before the book could be taken seriously. But I think the problem is that South Asia has never been a home for Kashmir. And noting the way Kashmir gets typecast within South Asian studies literature, I've searched quite intentionally for epistemic communities outside of South Asia altogether, such as within indigenous scholarship and Black studies or some other mode of knowing rooted in different histories of exclusion. Alexis Pauline Gumbs and Leanne Simpson remind us that Black and indigenous intellectual formations come already after the end of the world. And I think a weaving of indigenous and Black epistemology for Kashmir is generative, not simply because people in each location suffer as they do, but because they refuse the conditions of death being imposed upon them. And I think in the convergence and disjunctions that arise, there's hope for new and creative lines of inquiry for the region. And the underlying intention is to dislodge Kashmir from being only a geopolitical problem requiring only a geopolitical solution, as frequently referred to by security analysts and control theorists who are unwilling to acknowledge the alternative memories and aspirations for the future held by the Kashmiri people. So, as mentioned earlier, the line of control is heavily militarized, with armies stationed on both sides, weapons and guns blazing. Firing and mortar shelling can start at any time. And this cross-border violence was at its peak during the 1990s. This was the time when the Kashmiri liberation movement was at its peak, when Kashmiris on both sides of the line of control were engaged in an armed struggle for azadi, or freedom, sovereignty, self-determination, against the brutal Indian occupation. And for some 13 years, the sub-region was in the middle of an active cross-border conflict. Thousands of civilians were killed, maimed or injured. Infrastructure, livelihoods, and life projects destroyed or put on halt. And it was only in 2003 that a shaky ceasefire of sorts was reached, bringing some relief to the volatile region. But even now, fighting between the two militaries can start at any time. And this period of calm was short-lived. Just 2 years after, in 2005, a massive earthquake devastated these mountainscapes, crisscrossing Kashmir and northern Pakistan, followed by widespread monsoon flooding in 2010. And together, the two environmental disasters, disrupted the lives of some 25 million people throughout Pakistan and Kashmir, activating an era of intense humanitarian incursion. And there's been recurring flooding ever since the region is home to more glacial ice than anywhere else in the world outside of the polar regions. So, with rising temperatures come increasing floods. So, while a ceasefire is officially in place, skirmishes flare up unannounced at the line of control very frequently, bringing life to a standstill. And so communities must, navigate the uncertainties of the ongoing conflict, and their lives are worsened by unpredictable environmental collapse, along with other forms of diminishment, such as, deep-rooted structural poverty, lack of services, infrastructural violence, isolation, and so on. So for the rural and pastoral Bahari people, violence is omnipresent, always life-shaping, constant, chipping away. Yet as the protagonists of this book demonstrate, and as one of my interlocutors often reminded me, life finds a way. Or zindagi phir bhi guzarti hai. So how can we think about violence when it is everywhere, atmospheric? Or as Christina Shore puts it, forms the weather? And how does life find its way despite the violence it bestows? And what does it mean to live within dystopia's dailiness? What is the social labor through which people refuse the conditions of death imposed upon them? These are some of the questions that animate the book. One of my interlocutors, he remarked that, the air may be fresh here, but it's also very heavy. So it is this heaviness that I'm interested in. And people would often say to me, the atmosphere of the mountains is such, or in Urdu, यहाँ का माहौल ही ऐसा है. So it is this very atmosphere, or the mahal, that the book is attendant to. And this is important because the violence in the mountains, its diffuse yet palpable nature, cannot be reduced to a single texture or tonality, such as bodily harm caused by cross-border conflict or cross-border shelling, or the collapsing of one's home during an earthquake. The violence has a lingering intensity, almost an immense, ethereal concentration. So then, what clues can an attunement to the atmosphere provide about life's intensity in a world on decline? Um, this video is taken by a young man on his cell phone. He struggles to contain the scope of the flooding within the frames of his phone. And you'll see him, zoom in and out. And in a sense, that's what disasters are, right? Uncontainable, that which exceeds the frame. So my initial, impulse was to document experiences of the earthquake and floods, but people spoke actually very little about these spectacular events. I also did not insist. Instead, our conversations, revolved mostly around rather ordinary experiences, such as those of the betrayal of a close friend, the fear and hold of the military, or just the sheer boredom of being young and lonely in these mountains. And within these, unassuming details lay incredible clues in how people grapple with the afterlife of disaster, how they sustain themselves, find nourishment, breath, and breathing. So I instead then became interested in the affective and its minutiae, the slippage of relations, the withering of friendships, the slice and grudges, life's growing pains, to come to grips with the multiple forms of violence that foreground life in these mountains, and not just, the earthquakes or the floods. And I came to understand that while these disasters were substantial events, they did not encapsulate the entirety of people's experiences, nor represented the full range of the violence at play. In fact, they were just, another blow in a long duree of violations, diminishment, and dehumanization. Catherine Youssef writes, the Anthropocene might seem to offer a dystopic future that laments the end of the world, but imperialism and ongoing settler colonialism has been ending worlds for as long as they've been in existence. So I too have found in my work that disasters are, rarely definitive ruptures of some coherent life world, but perhaps part and parcel of the ongoing labor of making life viable. And I've come to understand disasters as cascading forms of violence, and they're part of the ongoing chronicity where large and small events fold into each other. And by chronicity, I mean, the convergence of multiple forms of violence in the body, subjectivity, and sociality. So I'm interested in how chronicity unfolds in everyday life, is particularly situated, localized, and contextual, and how people, make incremental and radical adjustments in relation to each other and their social worlds. And to answer these questions, I got interested in the idea of flourishing. Lauren Berland asks, why are there only so few words for flourishing? In a crisis culture, we're so excited about gaming the difference between 0 and 1 that flourishing somehow gets bracketed and survival looks like a triumph, and that's a terrible thing. So in my work and in this book, I understand flourishing as the ethical and moral risks people take in their daily lives that carry political and existential stakes, which offer clues on desires, futures, and wanting past and presents. And the flourishing refers to a sense of aliveness, which Kevin Quashie argues, cannot be mapped in the syntax of Western norms. And to bring these discussions, closer to the mountains, I look at flourishing, within the more familiar heuristic of maza. Maza in Urdu means pleasure or joy, the verve and joy of a life ontologically well lived. Jonathan Andrea and Ulka Andrea describe maza as sensuous, which draws us to life's viscerality and exerts an embodied pull on us. And they say, dwelling in maza does not mean ignoring inequalities, violence, or power, but finding new ways of writing about the forms of life that thrive even in times of crisis. So I think the task is to search for life, for more life, to expand the repertoire of life itself. And so I try to capture, how else to be in the world, how to live with collapse, not knowing what is on the other side, the beautiful, but also the cruddy. What Rana Kabadia says is the task is to make sensuous, what has been ghosted. And to do this work, the book is organized into scenes. A scene is basically an affective swirl, a blending of theoretical and ethnographic textures. Or they can be thought of as a framing device through which specific aspects of the feeling world are rendered palpable. So as affective swirls, The scenes invert emotions, enlarging them as atmospheres shaped by the very social and political context that inform them. Each scene is dedicated to a single interlocutor, and together they forced us to hold extraordinary violence and ordinary concerns in the same breath. So, sensation is in excess in the mountains. It is too much to handle. And I feel that textual representation cannot do justice alone. So you'll find that the book is visually rich, and many of these images were taken by interlocutors themselves, and they've been credited. So Tina Camp asked, what does it mean to listen to images? And she suggests that listening to images means opening oneself to the many ways images and photos make contact. And she also insists that the encounter with images can also be sonic. Some images register a quiet frequency that is not the silent, to convey, the softly buzzing tensions of colonialism, the low hum of resistance and subversion, the anticipation and performance of a future that's yet to happen. So I'm going to quickly now, give you some glimpses of the people who animate the book. So the first, the scene is dedicated to Niaz. Niaz is permanently paralyzed as a result of an injury. He's paraplegic. But Niaz does not attribute his most profound dysphoria to either the accident which led to his injury or the earthquake which destroyed his village, but to the disloyalty of his best friend. And Niaz helps us to understand that disasters are perhaps forms of betrayal, which can catalyze conditions for letting each other down. So think of the earlier video of the flooding. Disasters are what is inside the frame, as well as what is outside of it. And he compels us to consider, is the disaster a betrayal, or is the betrayal a disaster? And what constitutes a disastrous event, and who names it? Then we have, Perveen, who volunteers as a midwife in the memory of her deceased husband. And this is a context where healthcare has been largely outsourced to the military. And she brings to the fore how people acknowledge and maintain regard for one another through the smallest acts of kindness and the minutest of gestures, such as making someone laugh when they're in unbearable pain, or offering a cold glass of water to women in childbirth. And Praveen, helps us think about moral presence and how mundane practices of kindness and care can create the background conditions needed for broader social and political change. We have Sattar. Sattar calibrates his investments and reliance on others as being subservient to his relationship with God. And he's arrived at the conclusion that only God has stood by him, through the various trials and tribulations of life. And central to his reciprocity to God is the rejection of everyone else and all that is worldly. So, how can you understand the social and its repair for someone who exceeds the social? And I find that Sattar's intense relationship with the divine is in fact, cumulative and accretive of the very social he seeks to reject. We have Abrar. Abrar, is a young man who's desirous of a world that is not permitted to have. For him, things seldom go as planned, even simple things. This is getting an important letter delivered on time or getting his name spelled correctly on his high school diploma. And Abrar, compels us to think about all those ugly feelings, frustration, anger, annoyance at a life that constantly derails. And he helps us see that ugly feelings can lead to their own social formations and way of relating and rendering any kind of singular or fixed sovereignty non-operational. And finally, there is Chandni Bibi, who insists that the earthquake made her blind, despite her family insisting that her vision was impaired ever since she was a child. So, with the earthquake as forever coded in her blindness, Chandi ensures that the earthquake is not reduced to an event that can be resolved and recovered from. And if you truly consider, her blindness as social commentary and critique, we can begin to appreciate the multiple ways disasters are lived, embodied, and surpassed. This is, just to give you a sense of the range of people who breathe life in the book. And the scenes, demonstrate people's expectations from life that perhaps no one can satisfy, in a kind of sovereignty in the making or a fractured sovereignty. And in this web of expectations, nothing is final or stable. There's always something that is yet to come, an element of wonder. I'm going to start closing off by just leaving us with a few pressing questions, which I think are important. First, to get back to my earlier question of, why do we write, research, produce scholarship? What does it mean to write about people, communities, places which are subjected to enormous forms of violence, where the stakes are much higher than just knowledge production? So does, knowledge only matter when it fills in gaps in the literature, when no one lives their lives along disciplinary lines? Um, does knowledge only matter when it appears as, peer-reviewed articles or in monographs, such as the one I wrote? Kiguru Macharya knows that so much knowledge exists as songs and dances, as gossip and rumor, as barely understandable markings on trees and stone floors. Yet we keep insisting knowledge is only credible as peer-reviewed articles and monographs. I think it's important for us to recognize that disciplines are not designed to honor our obligations to the places we inhabit or the people we meet. Discipline is empire. Disciplinary power works in tandem with biopower. The roots of disciplinary knowledge lie in the same mechanisms of control in the prison, the factory, the slave ship, the plantation. And I think colonial disciplines for extraction give way to colonial disciplines of extraction. So really the same imagination that goes into the formation of the nation state informs our production of disciplines. And nation states then don't disappear from our analysis and future imaginaries because disciplines don't. And if you ask me, then what is alternative to discipline? And I think the answer is it's accountability. And then, who are we accountable to in our work? Is it the discipline, the profession, the institution, our relations? What if they collide as they often do? And who sets the standards and holds us to them when institutionalized accountability is too self-interested, too self-absorbed, or insufficient, even absent? So, who is allowed to shift the border? The Circle's conspiracy of writers is an anti-colonial collective that writes about borders, and they recall the story of a Belgian farmer who accidentally shifted the French border to drive his tractor across farmlands between the two countries. But nothing happens to the farmer. He's a white European man. No one feels threatened, and the transgression is dismissed as an amusing story. But they ask, what happens when brown, queer, feminists, and decolonial movements try to shift lines and borders? I think the discipline too is the colonial border. It is important to note who is allowed to rework that border. And finally, are you doing the work? Audre Lorde often asks, are you doing the work? And she's referring to, the introspection and deeper conversations that still need to be had. Kaguru Macharya wonders, what is the work? Sometimes we're sure that we forget to ask, what is the work? I think if you ask me the question as someone who writes in Kashmir but is not Kashmiri, I've not understood my work as that of defining, freedom, sovereignty, self-determination, or providing, expert commentary or imposing concepts on a life already constrained. My task, as I understand it, is rather modest, is to enlarge and expand the frames of legibility of Kashmir, to stretch the relation between possibility and desire, and to prod and poke the realisms of imperial map making, borders and boundaries. And finally, what is the work to you? And is the institution the place to do this work? And I'll just leave you with these pressing questions. Thank you.